Hi, everyone. I'm Lorrie Goldstein of Sun Media, and I'm here today with Sun Media's esteemed columnist from out west, Lorne Gunter. And Lorne, there's so much going on in the world today, we can barely keep up. But one of the things that's about to happen is that Justin Trudeau is about to raise his carbon tax by 25% on April 1st from 8.8 cents per liter to 11 cents per liter. Given all that's going on in the world right now with energy security and energy prices skyrocketing because of a number of reasons, tragically the war in Ukraine, but also we're still trying to recover from the COVID-19 pandemic. What do you think about hiking the carbon tax right now by 25%?
Yeah, it's absolutely the wrong time to do it, and it's counterproductive. I mean, the reason that the carbon tax was brought in was to make using gasoline more expensive, using home heating fuel more expensive, so you wouldn't use as much of it. Well, the rise in oil prices, the rise in prices at the pump, inflation have already made it difficult for people to afford to fuel their cars, to drive the kids to soccer or hockey, to heat their home as warm as they'd like it in the winter. All of those things are already being achieved by market forces. So the only reason the government would then bring in an added tax on top of that would be because it likes the money. It wants the income, and it has nothing now it's separated the reason for bringing in a carbon tax from the effect of the carbon tax, and it's now just another tax. There's no moral there's no moral angle to it at all.
I agree. I also think people don't understand the number of taxes there are on gasoline already. There are provincial taxes which have nothing to do with the carbon tax. There's the HST, which has nothing to do with the carbon tax. There's the federal excise tax, which has nothing to do with the carbon tax. And perhaps most outrageously, there's the GST on top of the carbon tax, because a tax on a tax, which, as I understand it, the vast majority of economists totally disagree with. You don't put a tax.
Right. And yesterday, to give you an example of what that means, BC also has its own carbon tax. And on top of that, in the lower mainland, around the Vancouver area, it has a 17-cent a liter tax to pay for transit. So you're being punished if you drive in order to subsidize people who take the bus. And you add all those taxes in, if you drove across the line into Washington State, which is a very, very short distance from some of the suburbs of Vancouver, you were looking at gasoline that was the equivalent of about $1.20 a liter. In Vancouver, it was $1.94. So that's the tax difference there, 74 cents on the liter. So more than half of the actual cost of fuel is then added on as tax.
Yeah, just which would make, I think, clear to our listeners that in terms of the federal carbon tax, it's going to go up from 8.8 cents per liter by 2.2 cents, or 25%, to 11 cents per liter on April 1st. When that tax is fully in place, if Justin Trudeau or the Liberals, I guess, are still in power, it will be, in today's dollars in 2030, 34.7 cents. That's for the carbon tax alone. So we are talking about big dollars in addition to all the other taxes on gasoline, which, Lorne, you're absolutely right. Those are carbon taxes, all those other.
Of course. But also, like every other revenue stream, governments get addicted to the cash. It doesn't matter what the purpose of that tax initially was, to fund schools, to cut down carbon emissions, to do whatever. Eventually, governments just get addicted to the money. And that's really dangerous, because then it ceases to become a policy directive, and it becomes more of just a cash cow.
I think also the Liberals sold this very deviously as that, well, we're going to have rebates and we're going to give all the money back to everybody. First of all, that's only in 4 provinces which have had the federal carbon tax imposed on them. Mm-hmm. Second of all, like already the parliamentary budget officer, the independent nonpartisan officer, says, well, no, actually only about 60%, like about 40% of the households in Ontario are now paying more. Also, it doesn't cover the indirect cost of carbon taxes. They always talk about natural gas and gasoline, but when you raise the price of fossil fuel energy, everything goes up because everything uses fossil fuel energy.
Yeah.
Also, the federal taxes, the GST and HST, are eroding that difference. So, and also, how can anybody possibly calculate their number? Because it's not based on how much carbon energy a family uses. It's based on family size. It's just insane. I did want to ask you one other thing. Stephen Guilbeault, the federal environment minister, gave a couple of media interviews this week, and he said, "Oh well, look, Canada can't fill the Russia supplies 10% of the world's oil and 40% of natural gas to Europe, which is of course a huge issue right now." And so he said, "Well, look, Canada can't fill that gap. We don't have pipeline capacity." So knowing as you do about the history of Stephen Guilbeault, I'd like you to comment on that. My view, that was like a child killing his parents and asking for mercy from the court because he's an orphan.
Because he's an orphan, exactly. That's precisely what that's like. I mean, this is a man who spent his entire adult life, his whole professional career, including in government, trying to stop pipelines. And he has been quite successful at it. He has certainly, since he's come into the government, only reinforced Justin Trudeau's anti-oil, anti-energy views to begin with, and fed this fantastical notion that somehow we can stop climate change if we in Canada don't build pipelines. I mean, I remember one time Guilbeault saying it wasn't the pipeline that bothered him. It was in the pipeline that bothered him. And that actually was very instructive to me because, you know, you always thought in the past about pipelines, people were opposed to them because they didn't want the actual pipeline to run across their property, or they didn't want it under the ground where it might leak or something. It was the physical pipeline that was the problem. With him, it's not. It's the idea that you're going to take fuel to, you're going to take a raw material down to a refinery that's going to turn it into fuel that will be where there'll be emissions when it's burned. And that was very instructive to me. But this is a man who has spent his entire life doing that. And now all of a sudden he's saying, well, you know, sure, it's a nice idea that we should help out the world by pumping more energy, but we really can't because we don't have the pipeline capacity.
I think we also need to be, I think we should be clear to the audience that there is a cost to this in Canada of our lack of pipeline capacity. That means that the vast majority of our oil and natural gas resources, and we are one of the biggest producers and exporters of those desperately needed commodities in the world.
And one of the cleanest. That's another thing. One of the cleanest producers. Yeah.
And the vast majority of it has to go to the United States because it's the only market we have. And therefore, we sell that oil and gas at a we lose tens of billions of dollars year after year because we have to sell it discounted to the US because we can't get a gas pipeline or oil pipeline to Tidewater. That means to the ocean, where then you could take it and you can move natural gas because it's called liquid natural gas. And then you can move it around the world. So if we had had a coherent energy policy, literally right now, we could be helping Ukraine directly. We could be helping its allies to stay firm, and we would be making money. It's a classic example of doing the right thing politically that would be the right thing morally. And we can't do it because of a Trudeau government that thinks of oil and gas as best left in the ground.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. And to just end this discussion with one tiny little thing, while they're not talking about any of that, not talking about holding off on the carbon tax increase, not talking about, you know, becoming a part of the world's energy security solution, they were debating yesterday in the House of Commons environmental racism.
We know that the impacts of climate change are felt more acutely by marginalized or minority groups, and this bill would ensure environmental racism is addressed and prevented.
This government wants to eliminate environmental racism because apparently people who live too close to garbage dumps or to environmentally dangerous projects tend to be Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and therefore it's the systemic racism of environmental regulation, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, they can get themselves diverted into something like that and not deal with the economic impacts, the impacts on ordinary Canadian families of increasing their carbon tax, or the fact that we cannot even become energy self-sufficient and rely on Russian and Venezuelan and other conflict oil because we won't build the capacity we could easily build in this country.
There's so many problems with that argument. And I think it speaks, Lorne, to just the cynicism that we see, the frustration and anger we see through things like the Freedom Convoy.
Absolutely.
But just that, okay, if you want, where do all of humanity at every level, where do they do best? They do best in industrialized countries that have the financial resources to assist everyone. So my argument would be, if you are worried about environmental racism and the quality of life of people, then you should be mourning that we have forfeited billions of dollars in government, not only in economic activity, but taxes to the federal government that could be used for the various things we care about. I agree that minority groups often don't get a fair shake on everything from where the hospital care is to where jobs are. Absolutely, but we could take that revenue and fund those programs infinitely without going into further deficit if we just weren't giving up billions of dollars every year, because on the major issue of our time, which is energy security, the Trudeau government has gone precisely in the wrong direction.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Anyway, I'm Lorrie Goldstein of Sun Media. We're always interested in hearing your views, and please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and our YouTube channel.